All right, so you see these headlines all the time about countries cutting emissions, and it sounds pretty impressive, right?
Yeah.
Like, take the UK, for example. They've been really proud of hitting these targets, getting their greenhouse gas emissions way lower than they were back in 1990.
Hmm.
And on the surface, that sounds amazing,
Right.
right? Like they're really tackling climate change, they're leading the way. But there's a catch, and it kind of makes you question the whole thing. A lot of that reduction, like a huge chunk of it, came from them switching from coal to natural gas.
Okay.
And they did that way back in the early 90s, like before Kyoto, before any of these big international climate agreements were really a thing.
Interesting.
So it's kind of like, well, did they really fix the problem, or did they just kind of shift it around and then pat themselves on the back for it? You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a bit like sweeping the dust under the rug and then saying the room's clean. Right.
Exactly. And it really makes you think, what does green even mean in this global context?
Yeah.
And who gets to decide that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it really gets to the heart of what we're diving into today, this whole idea of ESG.
Right. ESG, environmental, social, governance.
Exactly. It's this framework, and it's
Yeah.
becoming increasingly important for global institutions that are trying to, build a sustainable world order. It's about making sure environmental concerns, social responsibility, and good governance are all part of how institutions operate and invest. The big idea is that creating a healthier planet, a more just society, those things should go hand in hand with economic activity.
Absolutely. But as we saw with that UK example, it's definitely not as straightforward as it sounds.
No, not at all.
So the big question we're grappling with today is ESG actually a real workable path to a sustainable future for everyone?
Mhm.
Or is there a chance it's being kind of hijacked? Like maybe even becoming just another commodity within the very system that caused a lot of these problems in the first place?
That's the debate. And it's a crucial one because it gets to the heart of how we're trying to govern our shared future, right?
Right. And that's what this deep dive is all about. Unpacking the nuances, the little things you don't always see, the controversies, to really understand how ESG is playing out in global governance. So where do we start with all of this?
Well, I think it's helpful to look at this idea of climate capitalism.
Okay, climate capitalism. That sounds like a bit of an oxymoron, doesn't it?
It does, right? Because capitalism is often seen as like the root of environmental problems.
Hmm.
But what we're seeing now is capitalism adapting to the realities of climate change, almost like it's creating new things to buy and sell because of it. And the biggest example of this is probably carbon.
Carbon.
Yeah. So think about it. Carbon, it's like this invisible byproduct of industry, right?
Yeah.
Something we used to just dump into the atmosphere without a second thought. But now it's become a valuable asset, a commodity, something to be traded.
You're right, like carbon credits and all of that.
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting because it ties into this concept called commodity fetishism.
Okay, I've heard that term before, but I'm not sure I fully grasp it. Can you break it down for us?
Sure. So imagine you're buying something like a new smartphone. You see the sleek design, the brand name, the price tag. But what you don't see are all the complex human relationships that went into making that phone.
Yeah, like the people who mine the materials, the factory workers, all of that.
Exactly. The miners who extracted the raw materials, the factory workers who assembled it, the shippers who transported it across the globe. Commodity fetishism is about becoming so focused on the product itself, the commodity, that we lose sight of all those social connections and sometimes the exploitation that are embedded in its production.
So we're kind of blinded by the shiny object.
In a way, yes. And this applies to carbon too. By turning emissions into something tradable, like a carbon credit, we're essentially allowing capital, allowing the market to extend its reach into areas that were previously outside of its logic. The atmosphere itself, forests that absorb carbon, even farming practices that can trap carbon in the soil. These all become resources that can be assigned a monetary value, bought and sold. It's almost like we're financializing the solution to climate change itself.
Wow, that's a really thought-provoking way to look at it. And I guess this ties back to that question of whether ESG is really a path to sustainability or just another way for the existing system to profit off the problem.
Exactly, because the concern is that this commodification of carbon, of nature itself, could actually disempower people and communities who have traditionally managed these resources in more sustainable, non-market-based ways. It's like saying the only valid way to address climate change is through this lens of capitalism.
Yeah, and that really narrows the scope of potential solutions, doesn't it?
It does. And it can also lead to resistance. Because when people see this happening, when they see nature being turned into a commodity to be traded on a global market, it can make them more aware of the underlying injustice of the whole system.
And it brings us to this really fundamental contradiction at the heart of the climate crisis, right?
Hmm.
Climate change is caused by burning fossil fuels.
Right. Coal, oil, and gas.
That's it. That's the source of the problem.
Absolutely. And yet, here's the paradox. Even though everyone's talking about the need to decarbonize, to get off fossil fuels, our entire global economy is still completely dependent on them.
Right. We've built our entire world around these things for the past, 200 years.
Exactly. Our infrastructure, our daily lives, everything runs on fossil fuels.
Hmm.
And it's proving incredibly difficult to break free from that.
Yeah, it's like we're all hooked on this fuel source that we know is toxic, and breaking that addiction is really, really hard. And hasn't the fossil fuel industry itself played a role in keeping us hooked?
Well, that's a common argument, and there's definitely some evidence to support it. The fossil fuel industry is incredibly powerful. They've used that power to influence policy, to shape public opinion, to maintain their dominance in the energy sector.
And so when you hear people saying that the solution is corporate self-regulation, that companies will just voluntarily clean up their act, there's a lot of skepticism.
There is,
Mm.
because history shows us that corporate self-interest doesn't always align with the public good, right?
Mm. And then there's this idea of, what was it called? Predatory delay.
Yes, predatory delay.
That sounds pretty sinister.
It is. It's this argument that the fossil fuel industry, while they might publicly acknowledge climate change, they're actually working behind the scenes to slow down the transition to a low-carbon economy.
Why would they do that?
Well, the argument is that they want to squeeze as much profit as possible out of their existing reserves.
So they're delaying the inevitable while they still can?
Exactly. And one way they do that is by promoting these future technologies, like carbon capture and storage. It's like they're saying, don't worry, we'll be able to keep using fossil fuels forever because we'll have this magic technology to clean it all up.
Yeah, but didn't we hear about carbon capture years ago? Wasn't it supposed to be this game changer?
It was, and to be fair, the technology does exist. But the problem is that it's really expensive and hasn't been proven to work at the scale that's needed to make a real difference. And some people argue that the very idea of carbon capture, the promise of it, has been used as an excuse to delay real action on cutting emissions.
It's like kicking the can down the road and hoping someone else will deal with it later.
Exactly. And that brings us back to those emission reductions that countries like the UK are so proud of.
Right. How much of that is real progress and how much is just creative accounting? And this whole issue of how we measure carbon emissions, who's responsible for what, it seems incredibly complicated.
It is. And it's not just about countries. We also have to look at institutions like the military.
The military. What do they have to do with carbon emissions?
Well, it turns out the U.S. military is one of the largest consumers of fossil fuels in the world.
Really?
Yeah. Think about all the planes, the ships, the tanks, the global operations. They use an incredible amount of fuel. And for a long time, that data was actually kept secret.
So even if they start trying to be more green, like using renewable energy on their bases, their overall impact is still going to be massive just because of the scale of their operations.
Exactly. And this raises the question, can we really talk about sustainability without addressing the role of the military?
That's a tough one. And then there's the whole issue of carbon trading.
Ah, yes, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement.
That was always so confusing to me. Can you explain it in a way that even I can understand?
I'll try. Basically, it allows countries to meet their emission reduction targets by paying for emissions cuts that happen somewhere else.
Well, a rich country could pay to plant trees in a poorer country and then count those trees towards their own climate goals.
Yeah, something like that. It's this whole idea of creating a global market for emissions reductions. But it's incredibly controversial because who really owns those reductions? Are these markets actually effective, or are they just a way for rich countries to avoid making real changes at home? There are a lot of concerns that it could actually create loopholes and undermine the whole point of the Paris Agreement.
It's a bit like we're trying to solve this global problem by creating a financial instrument.
That's one way to look at it. But it's not just governments and international agreements that are driving action on climate change. We're also seeing a lot of activity in the financial markets.
Right, like all this talk about ESG investing.
Exactly. ESG investing is about investors considering environmental, social, and governance factors when they decide where to put their money. And it's becoming a big deal because investors are starting to realize that climate change is not just an environmental issue, it's a financial risk.
So they're worried that climate change could hurt their investments.
Yes. For example, If you invest in a company that's heavily reliant on fossil fuels, their assets could become stranded as the world transitions to a low-carbon economy. Or if you invest in coastal real estate, rising sea levels could make those properties worthless. Investors are starting to pay attention to these risks, and that's creating pressure on companies to change.
So it's like, follow the money.
In a way, yes. Because if investors start demanding greener practices from companies, that could really drive change. But there are also some potential problems with this approach.
Like what?
Well, one concern is greenwashing. That's where companies try to make themselves look more sustainable than they actually are.
Oh, yeah, like those companies that plant a few trees and then claim to be saving the planet.
Exactly. They might talk a big game about sustainability, but their actual practices don't change much. And it can be hard to tell the difference.
So how can you tell if a company is genuinely committed to ESG or if they're just greenwashing?
That's the challenge, isn't it? Investors need to look beyond the marketing and really scrutinize a company's practices, their supply chains, their actual environmental impact. And even then, it's not always clear-cut, because at the end of the day, investors are still motivated by profit.
So if a company has to choose between doing what's right for the planet and making money, they might not always choose the planet.
That's a possibility. But it's not always that simple. We are seeing some positive developments like shareholder activism.
Shareholder activism.
Yeah, that's where investors, even big institutional investors, use their power to push for change within companies. There have been some recent examples of this at big oil companies like Exxon and Shell, where investors have actually forced the companies to take stronger action on climate change.
Wow, so investors can actually be a force for good.
They can. It's still early days, but it's a sign that things might be starting to shift. Investors are realizing that their financial interests are increasingly aligned with a sustainable future.
Okay, so we've talked about emissions, we've talked about finance, but what about the actual resources that our economy depends on? All the stuff we extract from the planet.
That brings us to the concept of the global environmental commons.
The commons.
Yeah. So the commons refers to all the shared resources that we all depend on, like the atmosphere, the oceans, forests, biodiversity. These are the things that provide the raw materials for our economies, and they're also the places where the negative impacts of our activities are felt most acutely.
And we're extracting more and more resources all the time.
We are. Even though we're getting better at using resources more efficiently, the overall amount of stuff we extract from the planet has been increasing dramatically for decades.
And that's having some pretty serious consequences, right?
It is. We're seeing deforestation, species extinction, pollution, climate change, and all of these things are interconnected. The COVID pandemic, for example, was likely caused by a virus that jumped from animals to humans. And that's a direct result of the way we're encroaching on natural habitats and disrupting ecosystems.
So it's not just about saving the planet for the planet's sake, it's about our own survival.
Exactly. Human health and well-being are inextricably linked to the health of the planet.
So what can we do to protect these commons, these shared resources that we all depend on?
Well, there are a lot of ideas out there. One is to conserve large areas of land and ocean, to create protected areas where nature can thrive. Another is to restore degraded ecosystems, to try to repair the damage we've already done. But all of these things require collective action.
And that's where things get tricky, right? Because getting global agreement on something as complex as climate change, that's a huge political challenge. We have all this scientific evidence, but it doesn't always translate into action.
You're absolutely right, and that's because climate change is not just a scientific problem, it's a social and political problem.
Mm.
The way we perceive risk, the way we frame the issue, our values and beliefs, all of these things influence how we respond to climate change. And there are a lot of different narratives out there, a lot of competing ideas about what the problem is and how to fix it.
So it's not just about the facts, it's about the stories we tell ourselves about those facts.
Exactly. And historically, the dominant narratives about climate change have been shaped by actors from the global north. But we're starting to see a shift
Towards what?
towards more diverse perspectives, more voices from the global south. There are a lot of exciting initiatives happening in places like Brazil and Indonesia, where they're trying to create more sustainable models of development that are rooted in local knowledge and values.
That sounds really promising.
It is. But it's important to remember that these initiatives are still facing a lot of challenges. They often lack funding, they have to navigate complex power dynamics, and they're operating in a global system that's still largely dominated by the same old actors.
So it's like they're trying to build a new world within the shell of the old one.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And this brings us to another important aspect of this whole conversation, the issue of justice. Yes, because climate change is not just an environmental issue, it's a justice issue. The people who are most affected by climate change, the people who are already facing the worst impacts, are often the people who have contributed the least to the problem.
So it's not just about reducing emissions, it's about making sure that the transition to a low carbon future is fair and equitable for everyone.
Exactly. And that means addressing issues of poverty, inequality, access to resources, and the rights of indigenous peoples.
Mm.
It's about recognizing that climate change is interconnected with all of these other social and economic issues.
It's a lot to take in, and it can feel overwhelming, honestly. Like we're facing this huge existential crisis and we don't really know how to solve it.
I understand that feeling.
Yeah.
And it's important to acknowledge that we're already experiencing the impacts of climate change. We can't just stop it anymore. It's already happening. But we can still limit the damage. We can still avoid the worst case scenarios. And that requires radical action.
Radical action.
Yes, the science is clear. We need to cut emissions drastically, and we need to do it now, like within this decade. The next 10 years are absolutely critical. If we don't act now, the consequences will be catastrophic.
So this is it. This is the moment of truth.
I think so. And it's not just about reducing emissions, it's about transforming our relationship with the planet. We need to move away from this extractive mindset, this idea that we can just take whatever we want from nature without consequences. We need to start thinking about ourselves as part of nature, as stewards of the planet.
So it's about a fundamental shift in values, not just technological fixes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Technology can play a role, but it's not going to solve the problem on its own. We need to change the way we think, the way we live, the way we organize our societies.
And how do we do that? Where do we even begin?
Well, I think it starts with recognizing the urgency of the situation. We need to wake up to the reality that this is not just some abstract problem in the future, it's happening now. And it's affecting all of us. And then we need to start demanding change from our leaders, from corporations, from ourselves.
So it's about individual action and collective action.
Exactly. We all have a role to play in this.
Yeah.
And it's not just about making sacrifices. It's about creating a better future, a future where we live in harmony with nature, where everyone has access to the resources they need, and where we've created a just and sustainable world for ourselves and for future generations.
That's a vision worth fighting for.
It is.
So to wrap things up, it seems like ESG is a really complex and contested space.
It is. It's not a simple solution. It's a process, an ongoing debate.
And it raises a lot of really important questions, like, is ESG really leading us towards a more sustainable world? Or is it just a way for the existing system to adapt and survive?
That's the key question. And I think the answer depends on who you ask, what their perspective is, and what their priorities are.
So it's not about right or wrong, it's about different visions of the future.
Exactly. And I think it's important for all of us to engage with these questions, to think critically about the role of ESG in shaping our world, and to consider what kind of future we want to create.
And that's something for all of you listening to think about too. Is the current path of ESG really leading us towards a sustainable world order? Or are we just witnessing a rebranding of the same old power structures? And what role can you play in shaping a more just and sustainable future? These are tough questions, but they're questions worth asking.